Hi guys, this is Vic from Plate.to.paper. Today I'll be covering an exercise from the second watercolor art kit that I worked on with Mossery, focusing on Japanese desserts. In this video I'll be referencing the materials included in this kit, but feel free to follow along with your own materials. So let's get started. Today we'll be painting Dorayaki, which is a Japanese pancake snack with a sweet filling. Let's start by going through the color mixes. First, the colors for the pancake. We have burnt sienna mixed with a bit of water. Next, we'll add permanent yellow to this. This gives the brown a yellow-orange undertone. We'll use these two colors for the initial layers of the pancake. Then we have a concentrated mix of burnt sienna, and we'll use this for the darker portions. Now for the crumb of the pancake, you'll see that it's a pale yellow color with darker spots. We'll be using a mix of yellow ochre and neutral tint. Yellow ochre by itself is a bit too saturated, so I'm adding the neutral tint to darken and desaturate it. We'll use both a light and concentrated mix of this later. The last set of mixes is for the filling, which is a red bean jam. We start with opera pink and light ultramarine. This gives us a strong purple, which we'll need to tone down with some burnt sienna. For the darker variation, we simply add some neutral tint. And you'll need to use a more concentrated mix of this later. And there we have it. The color mixes are done, so let's start painting. Let's start with our first pancake layer. Before we put any paint onto it, we'll prime the surface with a light wash of plain water. This will allow our paint to travel smoothly and evenly. And then I apply a little bit of burnt sienna. For the other pancake, I'm doing the same with the first water layer. I'll be applying the burnt sienna and yellow mix to this. Now, some burnt sienna towards the bottom half. Notice that I'm leaving the bottom of this lighter in color, and this will give an impression of a rounded edge. It's important not to add any more water to this area, as it will push the pigments away from the spot, creating an uneven wash. While we wait for these parts to dry, we can work on our first red bean layer. We'll use our first red bean jam mix, and here I'm leaving some unpainted spots which will act as highlights for this area. Don't worry if you paint over them, as we'll add some highlights in white later. While this area is still wet, I'm applying some spots of darker mix for some variation. To prevent the washes from bleeding into each other, I've decided to work on this pancake base next, using yellow ochre. Here it gets darker where it meets the other pancake. And now we have to take a break and wait for everything to be touch dry. The time needed will vary a bit depending on your environment. Now we'll work on the inner crumb of the pancake, using the mix of ochre and neutral tint in this wash. Try not to disturb the edge of the previously painted layers. We'll have to wait for this section to dry before moving on to the next section. Going back to the red bean jam on the other pancake, we'll repeat the steps from the first. Now that the first layer of the crumb is reasonably dry, we can add some details to it. Once you've loaded up your brush, I would advise dabbing it lightly on a paper towel first before going in. Having too much water on your brush will make controlling your strokes very difficult. And controlling what's on your brush is a big part of learning how to work with watercolor. From this point, we'll be going back and forth from the different sections, either layering with more color or adding more details. For these larger areas like the pancakes, if you find the area getting splotchy, it means the basemost layer hasn't dried enough. If that happens, try to gently nudge it back to even, but don't overdo it. Let it dry thoroughly and you can return to it and add more color to it later to even it out. So when I work on a piece, I try to get the main colors locked in as soon as I can. This allows me to build the values, and I'm constantly comparing them against each other and seeing how far to push them, according to the level of contrast that I want. I'm looking at form, shadows, and textures, and I'm building definition using deeper colors, layer by layer. When we apply layers of colors, this is a technique known as glazing. Two ways of using it is to create a third color from the overlapping of two different colors, or for deepening an existing color. As a general guide, with each layer I add, I'm using increasingly concentrated paint, and this reduces the likelihood of disturbing the pigment in the bottom layers. When it comes to food painting, and I'll say this often, but I strongly encourage you to find a good few reference photos to get a better understanding of the structure of what you're painting, especially if you're aiming for more realism in your work. Colors and textures tell us a lot about how the food is prepared and made and enjoyed, and bringing them out in the painting has always been extremely satisfying. I love working on these small details because they create so much texture and a bit of a story. Don't be alarmed if you think your progress is slow. I think this exercise took me just over an hour, including the drying time. You can speed things up a bit by starting off with more concentrated colors in the initial washes, but I've always enjoyed taking things slow and building values and details over time. Another reason why this rendering style takes longer is that we're using color to create definition, not lines. This gives us the realistic, rich 3D effect, as opposed to the flatter, lined images. Both are great, but in the end, it's a style preference. For these finer details, you can switch to a smaller brush. It's important to dab off any excess liquid or paint from the brush before applying the details. As we approach the finish line, I'm adding more definition to the shadows and the edges of the shapes. I find it's really in the last 10% where the piece really starts to shine. You'll see that I'm using the pink pencil included in the kit here. I use pink pencils a lot in my work as they provide a good form of soft definition compared to the harsher color and feel of black graphite pencils. It plays really well with all the common food colors, even green, and I use it whenever I have to mark out areas that need more detailing. For these finer details, you can switch to a smaller brush. It's especially important to remove excess liquid on the brush before applying finer lines. I use a scrap piece of paper and a drier brush to shape the tip of the brush before applying the final lines. I find that it really helps to use my pinky finger to stabilize my hand when I have to work on more detailed areas. Lastly, we'll kick up a thick mix of Chinese white and carefully dot some highlights into the gem. These highlights really help to make a picture come alive, and knowing how to preserve or to apply them makes all the difference. And that's it. We've completed our dorayaki. It's taken some time and effort, but I hope you had fun. And let me know in the comments if you found the tutorial useful and what you'd like to see in future videos. See you in the next one. Bye bye.